React and TDD is what I'm going to be talking about. First of all, a little bit about me. Who am I? My name is Siri. I am a full stack developer. I work for a company called Cygni, so I am a consultant or a contractor. And these are some of the clients that I've been with for the last couple of years. And what is TDD? Well, most of you probably know already that it stands for test-driven development. And it's something that, even though you've heard about it, it's not actually quite as new as you might think. It's been around since like the early 2000s. There was a guy called Ken Beck, an American software engineer, who wrote a book about this in 2002 called Test-Driven Development by Example. And in that book, he describes TDD as a way of managing fear during programming. He also goes on to say that TDD is not really so much of a testing method as it is a method of designing and developing and thinking about our code. And he talks about something called the TDD cycle, which is the process that we work with when we work TDD. So we want to start off on the red dot with a failing test. And we want to, from there on, move with the smallest or perhaps like the easiest implementation possible to get to a green passing test. And once we're there, we're not quite happy, but then we want to refactor our code and go back and look at how we can improve readability and how we can remove any duplication and basically make it easier for ourselves and for our fellow developers to read. And then we write another test, which is of course going to fail, turning it green, refactoring, going around this TDD cycle in small, very small increments. So how many tests should you write? Well, there's no one answer to this question. Of course, it completely depends on the code. It completely depends on you. But he also mentions, there's a quote in this book that I really like, which is saying that write enough tests until fear is transformed into boredom. And I think what he means to say is that we want to be so confident that our code does what we are testing it to do that we just get completely bored, basically. So why do we develop our code in this way using TDD? Well, first of all, it really inspires confidence because we don't focus on multiple things at once. We just worry or focusing about getting that particular test to go green. And then we move on to the next thing. So we keep like our focus like to a small scope, basically. And we can be confident that the code only does what is tested because we are starting with the test and then we implement like the smallest possible change to make the code run, which obviously leads to cleaner code as well because we only write enough code needed for the test to pass. And sometimes it's surprising how little code you actually need to make a test go green. And all this means we have an architecture and we have a design that's based on these test scenarios. So we get a really clean design as well. And of course, everything is at the end about finding defects before your user does. So the user is essentially the ultimate tester of your application. So if we don't test our code, then eventually the user is going to, trust me. And it's of course better if we find our defects before the user does, because it's better for the users, but it's also generally cheaper to find them before they go into production. So what about React and TDD? If you'd asked me like a couple of years ago if I thought it would be easy to use the test-driven approach in React, I probably would have said maybe, and then kind of looked at all my snapshot tests that were failing because I changed the name of one CSS class, and I probably would just be like, I don't really know. But now, like this year, and like with the tools that we have available now, I say definitely it is possible, and it is quite straightforward actually, which we're going to see in a couple of minutes. And it is mostly thanks to the tools that have sort of emerged in the last couple of years. So we're going to look at a couple of libraries today that you may or may not have heard of. One is React Testing Library. And we had a really good session here. I think it was like sometime before the summer, where I learned a lot about React Testing Library because it is like relatively new. But the good news is that if you're using Create React App, like I do in most of my projects, then Create React App now comes bundled with React Testing Library automatically. So you don't need to install this if you're using Create React App, which I think is great. The other tool we're going to look at is Mock Service Worker that we're going to use to mock our API calls. And I use both of these tools today in my production applications. And I think they're really good because they are super flexible and they don't care so much about how you implement the code. Just like a real user doesn't care how you implement the code, they just want the code that you are claiming that the functionality that you're claiming to be working, basically. So I think they're both really good tools to use with React. Okay, so what are we doing today? Well, we're going to implement using TDD, this kind of recipe finder React application. Of course, this is the mobile design that I mocked up in about 10 seconds with images from Unsplash. But it's going to look something like this. So we have a recipe finder as the heading. We have some kind of an input field with a submit button to find recipes. And then also we are going to render a list of recipes that we're going to fetch from an external API of some sort. So something like this, and I'll come back to this. So don't worry if there's a lot happening in this sketch. It could be overwhelming to look at it like that, but we're going to follow the rules of TDD. So we're going to take things in small steps. So we're going to start with like a super small test. And I'm going to switch over to my code editor. So you see I have two parts of the screen here where I have on the left-hand side, I'm really bad with left and right for some reason, but this is definitely the left. We're going to have a recipes component, which is obviously our React component. And on the right-hand side, we have our recipes.spec.js, which is the test file. And of course, because this is TDD, we're going to start writing in the test file. So we're going to start with a very simple test, probably like, yeah, the easiest that I could think of coming up with for this design. So I'm going to assume that you know how to like write code in React, and that like you perhaps have seen some of React testing library before, but if you haven't, then basically what you need to know is this render method that we're importing from React testing library is going to render our component, our React component inside this test. And it's not shallow rendering, so it's going to render any child components that it would have as well. And then we also have this object called screen from React testing library, which holds a number of queries. I'm not going to go into too much detail which query is best to use when, because there's like some good practices, really good documentation on the testing library website. So I recommend going in and checking that out. They have some really good documentation and best practices. But basically what this means is that we can query things in the rendered components. So we can query elements basically. So this line here is basically saying that I'm expecting there to be an element with the role of heading to have the text content recipe finder, just like we saw in our design. And because, of course, I haven't even written anything in my component file, so we know already this test is, of course, going to fail, but that's absolutely fine. That is the TDD approach that we're taking, so we expect this test to be read now. And it is. And it's a bit of a weird error message, but basically it's saying that we're not rendering anything here. This is not like a valid React component. So how do we go and fix this issue? Like what's like the easiest or simplest way that we can make this test green? Well, there's like multiple ways of writing this in React, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining like the implementation because that's not the important part here. Like I said, React testing library is super flexible and doesn't really care about how you implement stuff. So I'm just going to start writing like a simple class component. And if you're wondering why I'm writing a class component in 2020, then hold that thought. But basically, this is like a way to make the test pass, writing an h1 tag, which maps to the role of heading and including the text content that we're expecting. So if we run this test again, hopefully you can see the output here. And now the test passes, so it's green. And then we have a final step in this TDD cycle. We're now going to go back and refactor our code. And this might not be that much that we can refactor. Like the only thing I can think of is perhaps to like remove this unnecessary div. But it's still worth going back and looking at our code and thinking how we can make this read better, or how we can make like remove any duplication. Maybe this text is coming in as a prop. I don't know. We still want to go back and take that refactoring and doing that step. So now once we have refactored, we're going to run the test again just to make sure we didn't break anything. And we didn't, so we're fine. Okay, so now we've kind of, we're going to focus on this top part of the mobile design still. So we've looked at the heading, and we're going to have to check that there's some kind of input field that the user will see, and it's got a placeholder text, enter an ingredient to find recipes, and we also need a button with the text find inside it. So there's multiple ways, again, you can implement this, but I'm going to, of course, start with the test because this is TDD. So I'm going to extend this test because it's the same, we're still in the same case when it's rendering. So I'm just going to update this. And I just wanted to say as well, if you, like, I know I'm not going to go and talk too much about these different queries from React Testing Library, but what I try to do in my examples and what I'm going to show you now is that the kind of philosophy of React Testing Library is to test as close to how the user would experience or interact with your code as possible. And that means making these queries using selectors that are like available both for people who use screen readers, but also those users that can see the screen. So things like checking for the get by the roles, getting by label text, get by text, and so on. Things that we can actually interact with as users rather than like how I used to write my tests with CSS classes and data attributes. But those are things that the user won't actually be able to interact with. So it kind of goes, it's more the idea with React Testing Library, I think more and more is getting to being as close to how the user would make this test or would test this in real life as possible. So we're going to make a couple of more expectations in this test where I'm going to look for the input, and I'm choosing the get by placeholder text query here just to show you a different one, and then checking that that's in the document. The button has a role of its own, so we're going to check that that has the correct text content. So again, let's run this test. And of course, we expect this to fail because we haven't implemented the form or the button. And now we get a really nice error message from React Testing Library telling us that it's unable to find an element with the placeholder text of enter an ingredient to find recipes, ... And we also get a nice printout here of our rendered DOM in the test. And we can see that we, of course, just have this h1 tag. We don't have a button. We don't have this input field. So let's implement that. Let's go and just write like the easiest implementation or the simplest way we can get that, just adding an input field with the type text and the correct placeholder and a button with the text content find. And if we run the test again, it should hopefully pass now. And it does. So now in the refactor step, again, there's not much that I can do, but perhaps like the most semantically correct thing would be to just wrap this in a form, since it is a form field. And maybe adding like a type submit on the button. And then we run the test again, and it should still pass. Okay, great. So we've just written our first React component using TDD, and that wasn't that difficult. But let's keep moving. There's a lot of things that we need to test for. So we've focused on this top part of the mobile screen. But how do we go about testing that we are rendering these elements that are coming as a result from calling an API of recipes? Well, this is where mock service worker comes in, the other library. And this library we're going to use because we want to mock the server-side data in our application because we want to be able to control the data that's returned from our mock API. So we have an endpoint here that we are going to use to fetch these recipes. It's basically using get method to a URL, which is /API/recipes. So let's mock that inside our test. And to do that, there's a little bit of setup we need to do. We need to import two more things. One is the setup server from the node environment of mock service worker. And the other one is rest from mock service worker. So we're going to declare an array here of all the recipes that we're going to be mocking as a response. And they each have an ID and a title, just like they would coming from the real API. But we're, of course, going to hard code these three values here. So just chosen burger, French toast, and salmon. And here's kind of where the magic happens with the mocking, where we're going to set up the server. And the server is going to listen to any GET request to this URL /API/recipes. And we're going to, instead of returning the real data, we're going to return a mock response with a JSON body where the recipes property is set to this all recipes that we just declared above. And if you're used to working with, for example, Node.js and Express, then you can see that there's like some similarities here in the syntax. You might recognize the way that this is written. And these 3 lines are really important as well. We're going to, before all the tests have started to run, we're going to make sure the server is listening and starting to intercept these HTTP requests. The next line, line 22, we're going to make sure we reset any handlers that are set in runtime. It's a bit like difficult to explain, but when we get to testing for error handling, I'm going to explain. I think it's going to make sense what that means. And finally, we want to make sure that after all of these tests have run, we need to close the connection with the server. Basically, we don't want that running when our tests are finished. Okay, so now that we have done that setup, we're going to make some further expectations in our test, and we should probably update this again. Oops. So here we're going to use, again, finding these list items by a role, which is list item, and that will map to li tag in HTML. And React testing library has special queries for when we want to find something in the tested component that is rendered asynchronously. So then we can use this find query. So basically that means that we can wait for a number of, I don't know, retries until this actually appears on the screen, because it's not going to appear on the first time the component renders if it's being fetched asynchronously. So we can use the async await here, and don't do what I always do and forget to put async there. So we can then wait the appearance of these elements, and then once we have them, we can check that they have a length of 3, because we had 3 recipes in our mock data. And we want to make sure the first one has a text content of burger, the second one French toast, the third one salmon, exactly like we defined in our mock response. So let's run this test now that we have made those expectations, and we obviously know that this is going to fail. But now, once that fails, we have something to work towards and we have something to fix. And my computer is not usually this slow, I think. Okay, so of course this test fails because we haven't implemented this list. It's not in the DOM yet. So we get this error message saying it's unable to find an accessible element with the role list items. And it actually gives us also the accessible roles, which is quite nice. And then again, we see here in the printout of the rendered component that we don't have these list items. We're not, basically haven't implemented that yet. So probably the easiest way to make this test green now would be to just like hard code these data. Just make sure I spell it correctly. And this is absolutely fine, like in TDD. Like it's fine to hard code data or faking things until you know like how you were going to implement the real implementation. There are no rules like about how many times you're allowed to go around the TDD cycle before you get the test to go completely green after like all your refactoring. So this is like one step that we can take, and a lot of the time you might not know how to implement something in your first try, and you will have to like watch the test fail many times before you can get it to go green, and that's absolutely fine. So now with this hard-coded data, the test is obviously green, but we see here that we have, of course, this duplication now between the test and the code, where we have hard-coded this data here and the same here, and the minute we write another test returning different mock data, this is not going to work anymore. And so of course we need to fetch this from the real API. So I'm going to go ahead and implement that in my refactoring steps. So I'm going to refactor this now, and I'm going to fetch this using the fetch. Of course, again, there's multiple ways we could do this. I'm just going to show you one example. And again, if you're wondering why I'm using a class component, I will get to that very soon. But I don't want to spend too much time explaining the implementation here, but what's important to see is that we're fetching data from the same endpoint as we are mocking in our test. And then I want to set some kind of state with the recipes perhaps. And then finally, going to get rid of that hard-coded data, render this dynamic data instead, where each of these recipes get a li tag each, and the title is the text content. So now if we run the test again, after we've done that refactoring, it should still be green, and it is. Okay, great. So now we have test-driven the implementation of fetching these recipes from the API, and we've checked for these like various elements that we are expecting in our component. And a common thing to do is like testing that we are handling server error scenarios in our code. Of course, we're working with APIs, so we expect them to fail from time to time. So we should probably have some kind of error handling. And this is, again, like a really good case for TDD. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to write a second test, because this is no longer like the happy path of rendering everything is fine. But now we're going to check that it displays an error message to the user when we're fetching these recipes, but that call is unsuccessful. So again, just like the previous test, I'm going to render the recipes component. But this time, I'm not going to wait to see these list items. I'm going to wait to see an error message with the text failed to fetch recipes. And I also want to make sure we don't see any of these list items, because we don't want to render them if the HTTP request fails. So if we run this test, we of course expect that to fail. Actually, we should run both of the tests. That was my bad. Let's run both of them. So we can see the first one is going to pass, and the second one is going to try and find this for a number of retries, and then finally it's going to fail. And we can see that we actually get the same list in the DOM in the failed test here, because if you look at a mock, we have told the test that every time it encounters this endpoint, we're going to return this list of recipes. But now we want the mock to behave differently for the purpose of this test, because we're testing a server error scenario. So we're going to override the previously defined mock with the server.use method from mock service worker. So what we can do here is, for the scope of this test, we can actually override this previously declared mock with a different response. For example, setting a status of 500 and a JSON body with the message internal server error. Of course, I could mock any HTTP status and message, but this is the one that I chose for this example. And this is where I should mention this line 22 becomes important, is because we want to make sure that we reset any of these handlers that we have now overridden in a specific test, so that it doesn't leak onto subsequent tests that we might have. So this one is quite important now. So let's run that now that we have overridden a mock, and we will see that we get a different error message. We still haven't implemented anything in our component, so we're still going to get a failing test. But now we get a different type of failure where it's still looking for some recipes in the state, and we don't have them, of course. So to fix this and make the test go green, let's get rid of that. And then we're going to do some error handling in our fetch all recipes method. So we're just basically only setting the recipe state if the response is fine. If not, we're setting this error message state. And again, there's like multiple ways you could do this. I'm not going to go into the specific implementation as much, but we're going to render this error message as text as well in our render method. And then once we've done that, we want to run all these tests again. And now they both pass. So for the refactoring step here, I'm going to make quite a big refactorization. And this is where I'm going to show you why I started off writing a class component, because a common thing that we do refactor in React is we usually, or it is like I find it's quite common, is to turn these like kind of legacy class components into functional components instead. So we usually replace this dot state with the state hook, and we replace like componented mount, and doing our side effects, we do that now in the effect hook instead. So we're going to refactor this to a functional component whilst keeping all the functionality that we still have. And before using React testing library, I would have been a bit hesitant perhaps doing this all the time, because I would expect making such a big refactorization would mean a lot of my tests would fail. But like I said before, React testing library is really clever, so it doesn't really care how you implement your code, just like the end user doesn't care if you're rendering a class component or a functioning component, or if you're using use state or a set state. It shouldn't matter to the tests either. So we're just going to like get rid of all of this class component stuff. And instead, we're going to render a functional component. And this is where, yeah, I keep saying that how you implement the code doesn't matter, because it really doesn't. And we now have use state, and we're going to use the effect hook to fetch all these recipes, and we're going to render the same content. So when we run both the tests again, they will still pass, because we haven't changed anything that actually matters to the end user. So I think that's a really, really good advantage with both these tools. And another thing, like the final thing that I'm going to show you, is something else that I've done some refactoring on in the past, is to change the module that is making these HTTP requests. So if you've been paying attention to the test code on the right-hand side, you can see that there's no mention of the fetch API here. We're not mocking a specific module. If we were using Jest to make our mocks, then we would have to mock a specific module. But we're not with mock service worker. We're just intercepting these HTTP requests. So meaning that I can replace this use effect with using a third-party library such as Axios instead to make the HTTP call. And of course, because it is third-party module, I have to import it. And because mock service worker is so flexible, it doesn't care who is making the HTTP request, if it's Axios or if it's fetch. So the test is still passing, and they're fine. And I think both of these tools really show their strength when it comes to how flexible they are, because refactoring is such an important step. You don't want to be hesitant making these things. You should still trust that what matters to the user is still intact, basically, when you do this refactorization. So of course, there's like a lot of things that we could test for in this application. We should probably do something to simulate the user interaction when they enter something into the filtering and pressing the button. And we should probably test for some like maybe form validation. And there's like a lot of things that I can think of. But I'm not going to show you that now. I'm not going to have time to do that properly. But I have written a blog article where I go through like a longer example and have like a full code example at the end as well. So I'm going to link that to you in the end. But hopefully these examples have given you some inspiration to go and use this and work test-driven even in your React projects. And hopefully we've now turned our fear into confidence, perhaps even boredom. Thank you so much for listening. And here is the link to my blog article that I wrote about this. And I'm going to post this in the chat as well at the end. So thank you so much. I will now have a look in the chat and answer questions. Okay. Where is the chat? Here it is. Okay. So shall I start straight away? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just gonna go.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. So this is a good question. How would you build mocks on top of Redux? I'm guessing it means like how you would test your code if you like usually you have Redux involved in this too, right? Or I think that's what it means. I didn't show that in this example, but like I mentioned, I think that it's not shallow rendering the component. So if we have Redux in our application, or we have to basically also render that in our tested component. So we have to render like any Redux providers, and we have to basically work with a mock store in that case. And there is like really good documentation on how to do that in React testing library as well. And yeah, that's something you set up like once for your project. It's a bit of like tricky at sometimes, but it's something you do once, and then you should be fine after that. And yeah, it's I think it's a different tutorial altogether going through Redux as well, but it's a really common use case. So there are documentation about that as well. Do we have? Sorry, just reading through the questions. Lots of thank yous. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can try this. What are the benefits of unit testing front-end application? I understand the benefit of end-to-end tests, but unit testing kind of pointless sometimes. Okay, yeah, I think like I understand this question. Let me know if I don't. But I kind of have stopped doing strict unit testing because, like this person, I think Albin said, I think I agree with the fact that like for me, it makes more sense to test components like not in isolation, because they're never rendered in isolation in the real application on the screen in real life. So I feel like especially with React testing library, the kind of philosophy there is that you want to try and test higher up in the tree or like in the DOM. And then because we're not shallow rendering, we are going to cover the kind of individual components as well. So there's no like rule for React testing library not to be used with unit testing. But I think it can be done for both integration tests and unit testing. But like for me personally, I think it's worth testing components like kind of not too much in isolation. Maybe that's like a controversial thing to say, but I think, yeah, in real life, the users never like the button is always like it's never really resonated with me to test like on click prop things and like checking that has been called number of times, because the button always does something. It's either like it's doing something and the user is always using these elements together somehow. So I think it makes sense to test what the user is actually going to get out of clicking that button, rather than just, oh, it works to click the button and it calls the prop. I don't know if you agree, but that's what I think. What do you like to use for end-to-end tests? Yeah, good question. I am using, like if I were to make a choice now, you don't always get to do that, unfortunately, when you work as a contractor, but I would use, I like using a tool called Cypress for my end-to-end tests, because it's written, kind of has like a similar syntax to like the other JavaScript testing tools. And it's kind of like, and has a nice interface to it. I think you should check out Cypress. I haven't tried it out with, there's a React test, or not a React testing library, but there's a testing library extension now for Cypress, which I haven't tried, but I think that's meant to be really good so that you can make these queries that I talked about, like the accessible queries, getting things by the role and label text and placeholder text. So I think that sounds like a really good idea. And in my next project, if I'm allowed to use it, then yeah, I'm going to push for that. Okay. How do you approach visual regression testing nowadays, seeing as you moved away from snapshots? Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like we still have some old snapshots in our application, but snapshots is kind of like the opposite of TDD. Like it's very hard to write the snapshot before writing the code, or it's, I don't know, I think it's probably impossible maybe. And visual regression testing is something that I've looked into before. I've used tools like Backstop.js and things to try and make like proper visual regression where you kind of compare pixels and stuff like that. And I think that's something that's really interesting. And so far I haven't, unfortunately, like if people know of good tools for doing this, feel free to share that with me as well, because I've yet to find a really good visual regression testing tools. Because the downside to all of this is that, I mean, we haven't tested any like real layout. We haven't tested any CSS basically in this. We can test that something has a class or whatever, but we still don't know how that's going to look when it's rendered, unfortunately, even in these tests. Okay, next question. That UI for running and seeing the results, was that in VS Code? No. I'm a bit embarrassed to say this, but I actually, in my civilian life, I use Java to code. So this is IntelliJ, which is a Java editor. But yeah, I don't know, maybe available in VS Code as well. But that was IntelliJ. Is it common to test more pixel accurate tests for things like different breakpoints when making reactive designs? Marcus is asking. Yeah, I mean, with Cypress, the tool that I mentioned earlier for end-to-end tests, you can set different breakpoints, or you can test in different like screen sizes and stuff like that for clicking, because obviously that is the GUI kind of clicks around for you in those tests, which I think is quite nice. But yeah, again, like testing how things are actually rendered on like a snapshot basis or visual regression basis. I tried tools like Backstop, but I just didn't think they really did exactly what we wanted to do. So happy to take suggestions there. Do you know if you can use Cypress with mock service worker? I don't know that, but I don't see why not, really. I don't want to promise too much, but I think like how it works, I think the mock service worker is really flexible, and the main kind of the use case it was developed for, I think initially it was not actually testing, but it was to have do mocks for local development. So you can have this set up like in your browser as well. So when you develop something locally and you don't want to go towards the real API, then you can use mock service worker as a layer between the browser and the real API as well. So it is very flexible. I would like to find out the answer to that question too, but I don't see why not. And Patrick's saying, I'd like to mention a Chrome extension I used recently, which was awesome for finding selectors for testing library using best practices. Okay, great. And he posted a link to that. So yeah, let's take a look at that, because that sounds like a good thing. That sounds like something I want to check out. And yeah, so David just posted this a blog post about using mock service worker with Cypress. So yeah, clearly it works. Great, thanks for that. But yeah, there's so many, like, I think we live in like a world of like best practices, and they keep changing all the time. And I know it's hard to keep up with all these things. And I think sometimes it's just like you just have to use common sense and do the best as you can. Like you can never, I don't know, fully like please everyone, I guess. But it's good. I think React testing library is nice because it is like clearly a very active community, and like a very they have some like good reasoning behind their best practices as well. That like I really like the accessible thinking, for example, between the queries, and they've started developing this alternative to, or I think it's something we can use now, like safely use, is the user event part of React testing library to kind of simulate user interaction as well. And I think it's something that they keep adding to it all the time. So I think it's like a really active project basically. So I think they have some good ideas. Okay, VS Code has a terminal as well, Taylor says. Okay, good. I don't like, it was a long time since I used VS Code, but I do imagine they have something similar. Mock service worker seems awesome. I'm curious if you have pointers for testing code that uses web workers or its own service workers for that matter. No, good question. I don't have anything that I've worked with that I can think of that has its own service worker or web worker. Yeah, if someone else has an idea, feel free to answer. But yeah, sorry. I've only literally started using mock service worker like, I don't know, this summer. So I'm very like new to it as well. But I really like it so far. I think it's yeah, it's a nice tool, especially because yeah, you can use whatever module you want and you can yeah refactor that like I showed you. So I think it's a nice, and also one thing that I like about it too, I can mention, it's kind of like a bit off topic, is that what I struggled to do with Jest was to mock when you had a like a search query string, like you had query parameters in the URL and you wanted to test different scenarios based on that, and you can do that really easily with mock service worker, which I think is nice. Okay, so we got a tip about something called Mirage or Mirage.js. It's pretty neat for mocking data too. Okay, cool. We'll check that out. I haven't heard of it, but thanks for the link. Okay, great.